Imagine yourself as a leader, perhaps in a time long removed, or perhaps not so distant. Your nation has recently won a hard-fought independence against tyrannical oppressors. You earn the renown of your fellow countrymen in brave deeds of resistance and valor. New threats now emerge on the horizon once again, and your comrades think you are the man to step up and confront them. You are not a lover of war, but you believe in civic duty, and moreover in setting a strong example. The people and the others in government give you the mantle of power and the tools at your disposal. You used to play within the old system, but now you have a chance to forge something new, or change the government itself with your newfound powers. The question is, what do you do? An opportunity like this comes but once in a lifetime. Do you seize it to entrench your power and mold the rest of the state around you, to serve you and your descendants, taking out any potential enemies before they had a chance to strike back? Or do you do the right thing? Do you do what you need to and step down, allowing a peaceful transfer of power after the crisis is concluded, and perhaps a chance for long-lasting institutions? The choice is yours.
So welcome to another episode of the Charlie Andrei Podcast. This time we will be talking about the idea of civic duty and morality using figures such as Cincinnatus in ancient Rome and George Washington and other leaders to kind of compare and contrast what they did and how they set an example for the offices that they held. And Yeah, it should be an interesting discussion. We can kind of take it from there and see what happens.
Yeah, the way this kind of came up is Andre and I were just talking about on a private kind of conversation about, figures we admire like George Washington, who was, of course, the first president of the US and set an example in many respects, but kind of the principles that he reflected, especially like relinquishing power voluntarily and kind of how his legacy is reflected in kind of the actions that he did and how he symbolizes selfless leadership, duty, re things like republicanism, simple agricultural life. I mean, of course, there's a lot of things you could say that are negative about Washington, and you could debate a lot of these things, but this is one aspect that we admire pretty. I think it's fair to say a lot of people admire him. And I think it's fair to say Andre and I admire him for what he symbolizes, especially through
Right.
this figure of Cincinnatus.
Right. So just give me some background. Cincinnatus was a Roman patrician during the very early Republic. So we're talking like all the way back, not long after the foundation of Rome itself, like 500 or early 400s BC. He was a patrician, which is one of the nobility. Like he was part of the land holding class. There was a conflict that came up against some other Italic tribe in Italy that the early Romans were up against. I believe the Sabines and the Aqueans, and basically he was elevated to the rank of dictator during this crisis. He stepped up to the plate. He did his duty. He was able to defeat the enemy, and then after that, he voluntarily relinquished his dictatorial powers and stepped down. And then he returned to the relatively simple life of a farmer as he did uh, before that. So this is a very exemplary kind of use of power in an early Roman context, and one which resonated throughout their civilization for many more centuries to come. Um, and especially during like the shaky early um, e- era of a republic, when you're experimenting with a new form of democracy, it's a little bit shaky. So setting a strong example through an action like this is important. And I think that was, definitely a key toward why the Republic stayed successful, in the coming centuries. There is some. He's like so far back in time that he's almost semi-legendary, actually. So at a certain point, I feel like his story became larger than the man himself. But I guess that's the important part at the end of the day is the story about him and the memory they have of him and his legacy. And Cincinnatus, as you may know, he actually lent his name to the city of Cincinnati in Ohio, which is one of the three main cities in that state. There were several societies actually that were inspired or named after this guy, including the Society of the Cincinnati, which have a museum house here in Washington, D.C. called the Anderson House, actually, which is interesting. Likewise, George Washington, who, as we all know, as every patriotic American knows, he defeated the Brits. He initially served with the British Army against the French and Indians. He did his duty, and then eventually he saw that, the British were being tyrannical against the colonies, and he decided to be their general and lead them to victory over several years. And he did a lot of heroic things, as we all know. And he was then, well, then there was a period of time which the founding fathers they debated about what form the new government would take. There was the experiment with the Articles of
Constitutional Convention.
Confederation. Yeah, the Constitutional but at first, there was the whole Articles of Confederation, which didn't work out because each state had too much power and their own currency and mint and everything and laws and borders and trade. So that was a little too chaotic. Then they aimed for a more federal system, of course, with the um, Constitutional Convention, and they wanted a strong executive or leader, of course, but they were worried that he would that this executive could be too powerful. They did, of course, model it heavily off of the example of ancient Rome, and yeah, they chose George Washington as the first president. Like, what better guy to lead the new country than the guy who fought and led them to victory against the the British. And after his role in office, he stepped down, and I think in 1799 he went back to his estate at Mount Vernon, and then he lived out the rest of his few days at that point until he passed away. So you see some similar interesting parallels between these two men's stories. And again, he was also at the start of our nation, which it led it created an important sort of uh, precedent for the office, and one that was obviously followed by other presidents, and then I guess it was enshrined in law. Um, Actually, Charlie, so like legally though, up until FDR, there
Yeah.
wasn't a law that actually set a term limit for presidents. They could be reelected as many times as they wanted, right?
Yeah, I think it was until like 1950 during the Truman administration, but basically FDR was the only president who went on to go beyond 2 terms because everyone kind of just followed Washington's example. And then the Constitution was amended so that presidents couldn't go beyond 2 terms. So that's kind of where we are since 1950. Um,
Right.
but it's interesting, like Washington and Cincinnatus. You said that it may be unclear whether he was truly a historical figure, whether everything that's kind of attributed to him in ancient Rome was necessarily, whether it necessarily occurred or not. And I think that's interesting because it's almost a parallel with the mythos of America. Like all nations kind of need this mythos that's woven in
Yeah.
symbolically, regardless kind of historical accuracy. And Washington also is like one of the key mythos figures of America. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to kind of make that parallel between them. And maybe they both, for the founding of a nation, you need to have like this humility and honor to create like a civic polity.
Right. But of course, also coupled with strength as well.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
couldn't just be
definitely.
anyone. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Cincinnatus and Washington were just these, awesome generals from all accounts. I mean, Washington at least won the Battle of Yorktown, drove back General Cornwallis
Right.
during the American Revolution that ultimately led to the Treaty of Paris and American independence being secured. Um, it's interesting just to consider kind of these mythic archetypes and what they mean. Like you said, in 1787 there was the Constitutional Convention. A lot of people were unsure who should even lead the convention, and they picked Washington.
Right.
And I think it's also probably appropriate to say that they saw in him envisioned a lot of Roman virtues, and like you said, the Federalist Papers and a lot of these founding fathers like Hamilton and Madison and Jay, who were authoring these debates, were citing to ancient Rome and Republican virtue and this idea of virtue that was really important in the early Republic. And even their the people making counter arguments, the anti-federalists, were citing to Roman virtue all the time too. So it was kind of like these differing opposing views. Um, so I think it wasn't just like political theory, but it was an attempt to build like this enduring mythos and drawing from the lessons of Rome and the American experiment of self-governance. And that's why Washington voluntarily relinquishing his power, not only as a general. Remember, he gives back the sword to Congress, and that's one of the
Yeah.
paintings in the rotunda in the Capitol
That is
building in
symbolic.
D.C. But he also gives up the presidency as well. So, I mean, he's clearly heavily influenced by these Roman virtues,
Yeah.
which I think you could say is both Roman but also Greco-Roman, like ideas
Yeah.
of self-sacrifice and this notion that get serving the country with morality that's not always a necessarily handed down from above is important. Um, it's interesting. I think Cincinnatus was bound by Roman ideals, but he still did something unusual. He rejects that trapping of power, right? And he does it voluntarily.
Right. Exactly. Which is very important. Which of course later dictators famously, such as Julius Caesar, did not. That was the whole reason they assassinated him on the Ides of March, because he crossed the Rubicon and just tried to take full power.
And that's coming
But
up. We're doing this on March 8th, so the Ides of March.
yeah, almost there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, but his action then set the precedence for the Roman Empire and basically the demise of the Republic. So it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to get too political, but like, I mean, what does that say about, other future presidents in this country who might, not want to relinquish power as much or be using the office for, you know, their own gains and wanting to cling to that power in any way, possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely probably the most important and valid question that one can draw from this podcast. But the way I was thinking about it was kind of from like a Nietzschean philosophical perspective, where you're almost at a paradox. Like Nietzsche talks about the will to power, and a lot of people think of that as kind of aggrandizing and aggregating power. But I think the way Nietzsche would have interpreted it is that you're overcoming yourself in creating values that aren't necessarily based on society's values. And of course, in Nietzsche's time, maybe that's like the Catholic Church or something, but it wouldn't necessarily, it would be any system of moral values. But what's the paradox in kind of interpreting Cincinnatus in Washington is like they they sort of created their own values by refusing these external moral impositions, which is what the Ubermensch should do, right? In the
Right.
Nietzsche system. So maybe like Cincinnatus is a proto-Ubermensch, but then Cincinnatus, despite being bound by that concept of Roman duty, he does that weird thing. He just gives it up, and it's not like a passive submission. He actively chooses his own path rather than clinging on to power out of fear. I'm not saying like Julius Caesar necessarily did it out of fear, because we could debate Julius Caesar's activities all the time.
Eh,
Maybe he thought he was doing what he thought was right, expanding the empire, economics.
Right.
Uh,
Although there was probably an element of like paranoia and fear because he had a lot of enemies too. So,
but it demonstrates that Cincinnatus and Washington were able to master their mind and like
right.
have this massive self-discipline that you don't always see. I mean, maybe you see it in Marcus Aurelius or something, but you don't really see it a lot in I mean, throughout history. I mean, it's hard to pick like people who, I mean, I guess Churchill, right? Like he loses the election after World War II and he kind of just gives it up, even though he saved Britain in a way.
Yeah, I guess Churchill's another pretty decent example. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting to kind of connect these. I mean, another Roman virtue is like amor fati. It's like love your fate. And I don't think he laments his station, right? He's an agricultural farmer, much like Washington, right? He has the call of duty. He's like, oh crap, this is going to be insane. And then he just comes back to his farm without regret. And it sounds like
Yeah.
Washington had no regrets about everything.
Right.
Um,
Um,
it's kind of an idea of affirming life and loving amor fati, right? That's love
yeah,
of,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um,
Love of fate. However, yeah, I mean, you got to wonder though, during Caesar's time and later, like the stakes were much bigger. Like Roman civilization was a much more developed situation, was much more complex than just like a few other, neighboring tribes threatening you. Uh,
mhm.
so I almost wonder if like the decision in some ways for Cincinnatus was like simpler. If again he was truly a real person that did all this and this wasn't just a legend created or embellished around, you
Well, I
know.
mean, the early republic had a lot of dangers, right? I mean, speaking of tribes, there was like Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory. Britain was still going to invade 10 years later. I don't think that they knew exactly when that was going to happen, but a lot of people predicted that the British would be invading pretty soon. Um, they had like France, a lot of debt with France and Belgium. Um, I mean, it's interesting. It's very, I think, in line with what you're saying is like, uh, I think someone who steps away from power actually is ultimately someone who's stronger uh than someone who holds on to power because there's the fear um and it's sort of more service driven rather than conquest driven and in a way that's more virtuous.
Hmm.
But I wonder, I mean, I don't know. Is it, but then there's a paradox there as well. Is that more humility? Because if a leader can walk away from power, that means he's more powerful than one who clings to it. So is actually that an act of dominance to say, "Hey, I'm walking away." Uh,
Yeah, you
maybe
know,
it's the will to power through restraint, and maybe that's a paradox in American
it's a
mythos.
paradox for sure, but it is a powerful action, I think, and it carries a lot more weight than you'd think. Uh, and yeah, it is a form of power, I suppose, in a way that they have the ability to hang on to it, but they don't. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and this is like a Greco-Roman idea, right? Like if we're talking about like Athens and Jerusalem, the myth of America is like the New Jerusalem, but the Republic is kind of like reason and virtue, which is what you would see in kind of the Athenian side of Athens and Jerusalem. When thinking about like the archetypal and symbolic architectures and grammars that are steeped into the American ideals.
Yeah.
Um, Just as a funny little interlude, I'm reading a book, Thomas Pynchon's Mason and Dixon, that kind of digs into similar themes that we're talking about. But Washington, of course, is a very fictionalized account. He kind of comes up as a guy who's smoking a lot of hemp, and he's a very funny and silly character, as is Franklin. And a young Tom shows up who gets the quote "in pursuit of happiness" in the book as well. But just a funny little interlude of that, just kind of early America.
That's funny. Yeah. No, I need to read that book actually. It sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's a funny read. I mean, do you think the symbols are more powerful than the truth? Because it seems like they were like, regardless of what Cincinnatus did. I mean, it's almost like the symbol of what he is more important than the truth, right?
Oh yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, I think he's just being he was mostly used as a symbol in later times. But there were other occasions where dictators, where people were, elevated to that rank in times of crises, such as during the Punic War, and like, I think the time when the Celts raided Rome, and a few other times. And those guys did, they also followed that example and stepped down. So yes, it set a powerful precedent in a lot of ways. One that interestingly was not legally enshrined. It was just it's a matter of like a unspoken sort of code of conduct or expectation.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting because it's almost like a moral code, but
Right,
it's a lot
exactly.
of people don't follow it is the problem.
That's true. Their potential for abuse always exists. Yeah.
Yeah, and then if you don't put it into law, I mean, it depends on what your perspective is. A lot of people think FDR saved the US, but on the other hand, I mean,
Uh-huh.
yeah, obviously, I guess the people who instituted the amendment had somewhat different feelings. It's just like if something is institutionalized, the question is, does it become a virtue? Like if it's the law, then you're just following
Yeah.
the law. You're not following
That's
a
the thing.
virtue.
It's no longer a virtue because you have to do it. You have to play with it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and there's ways, even when there is a law, to get around it anyway. So you can argue that laws, to some extent, they're not always so hard and fast, kind of depending on the state of the government and polity in which they operate. There are ways to get around them and twist them, to your needs, of course. But that's a whole nother, like, I guess, debate, whole nother discussion. But what was I gonna say? So yeah, the thing about FDR is interesting because, like, yeah, some people did say save the country. I think it was a very important, a very critical time, and he probably did what he had to do because you had the Depression and then the war right after, and you can't, change horses midstream. You gotta see it through. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And I think the person he picked as kind of a successor, somewhat knowing that he might pass away, Truman, I think held true to those standards and beliefs as well. I mean, a lot of it is it's interesting. There's a lot of invisible scaffolding behind kind of what we see as the American Republic, or maybe even any type of government and polity. There's a lot of philosophy, and vision. A lot of it, I think, is self-like mastery, just trying to control yourself. I think that's maybe why Stoicism is so big these days, or Neo-Stoicism. Uh,
right. It
things like
has
Ryan
definitely has
Holiday.
an appeal. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because I think it's like the idea that you can perhaps live this ideal of leadership without tyranny and help like, you know, build virtue. Maybe not just like even if you're not a politician, just within your own community of people and friends and whatever sort of organizations that you're a part of. And I think that's part of like, I mean, the self-mastery of like trying to transform yourself from like, just a dude, Joe Schmo, to like living kind of an upright life, right? And
Yeah,
having
which is, of course, much easier said than done, but having some kind of moral, guiding light or philosophy to help you with that is, I think very critical. Um, so I mean, Stoicism is definitely a good one. Yeah, I think it's been misunderstood somewhat in recent years and maybe a little oversimplified, right? And then perhaps used in the wrong ways by some people who have no direction in their life, and
yeah, yeah,
causing them to be almost a little bit like closed off to emotion, and just kind of letting things happen and being okay with things. And well, of course, there's a lot more to it than that, but some people kind of, I don't think they get the full, you know the full package out of it. And of course, we can have a different podcast about the merits
that'd
of
be
things
cool.
like
Yeah.
Stoicism, but yeah.
I mean, a lot of our podcasts seem to revolve around like Roman polities, Greco-Roman world, the Byzantine world, Dumasilian,
That's
Trifun.
true. Yeah. Oh, speaking of the Greco-Roman world, this whole thing in some ways ties into, well, you know how we are talking about Polybius a while back. I was
Yes.
watching something about Polybius as well, and how he took certain ideas from Plato and Aristotle about like the cyclical nature of civilization and government. Like he called it anacyclosis. Kind of this, you start with like a it's just a mob kind of chaotic mob rule. Eventually, a king gets elevated to power to rule above them because he has certain qualities. He's strong, he's a leader, like these two figures were, like Washington and Cincinnatus, and later, I guess, the Caesars, like Augustus. And then, they rule virtuously and set a good example, but over time, um, their successors lose sight of that because they inherited power. They didn't necessarily earn it. They, are just wealthy all their lives, then never had to work for anything. Then that can kind of lead to abuse of power. There it leads to a gap in understanding between, these nobility and the king, and then the actual people that they're supposed to be serving and governing in a way. And then after that, the tyranny can lead to it can break down into like, the rule of aristocracy, later oligarchy. Um, at some point, it's possible that people overthrow these dictatorial powers and form a democracy. I guess that's actually the step after tyranny, as we saw with the U.S. Um, and then also early Rome too. Um, and then after a democracy established, then you get this kind of oligarchy, and then corruption and whatnot, and then that kind of eventually cycles back toward, a breakdown in law and order, and this chaotic kind of mob rule under which a strong man, or leader, king eventually arises. So it's kind of interesting to see how like leaders like these two kind of fit in this wider pattern of governance, and like the shifting, types of governance.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think you just summarized the Anacyclosis really well of those cycles of government. I mean, you start off with that enlightened ruler, right, or the just ruler, and that
Yeah.
Cincinnatus. But if he doesn't give it up, he turns into a tyrant, and that's corrupt. And then the aristocrats, who are like the best, ruled by the best, right? They throw that guy over,
Hmm.
but then that can turn into an oligarchy where all the rich people kind of degenerate, and like the elites just run the show. Imagine that. And then
Yep.
like democracy is ruled by the many because they're fed up with those guys. But then that can lead back to mob rule, and then you need like a monarch to like
Yeah. So
yeah.
you
But
need
but
a
I think
daddy to lead them,
to
show them the
use
way.
the grammar and terminology exactly.
Yeah.
Um but I think what Polybius identifies and how he kind of builds off of Aristotle's point is that there's actually three good things you can take out of there. There's a good monarch, you want to keep him, right? But how do you do that? There's a good aristocracy, how do you do that? And then there's a good democracy, but then those can all degenerate, right? And I think what he says in the Roman Republic, what they did successfully is that they had three branches of government that all represented those things. And
Yes.
of course, that's what the
Yes.
founding fathers did. The president gets the monarch, but we can get rid of him, or well, you know what I mean, elect him out,
Yeah.
or
Exactly.
keep him
Exactly.
within 4 terms, as Washington did, or the Senate. They have limited terms, but it's kind of that's the aristocracy, and then you have the House of Representatives, which is the democracy. But
Yes.
we can get rid of them in elections and then cycle them out so they don't turn into a mob. We can get the aristocracy, they can be done and they're not a permanent ruling class. We vote them out and they don't turn into like the oligarchy.
Yeah,
So
exactly. And that's how like I mean, so Polybius was actually, when he was writing about this, he was describing the rise of the Roman Republic. which at the time he saw as breaking that problematic cycle through this kind of use of balance of powers and checks and balances, a mixture of aristocratic and um, democratic elements and institutions. And of course, as we know, that didn't last forever, which might be a warning about like the way democracy is inherently, in some ways, open to abuse. Well, even during the imperial era of Rome, especially during the early part of the empire, um, this sort of ideal of like the ruler still serves the people. It still had to be maintained, like there was a pretense that the Senate, which is an old Republican institution, still, held some sort of power, and that the emperor, the imperator, was, consulting them and working with them. So, it shows the power of institutions over time, even as the the type of governance changes and evolves. So that's an important point to make. Another interesting thing is that like this three um a government with like these kind of three branches that are balanced, it kind of parallels the whole Dumazzelian trifunctionalist kind of thing that we were talking
Yeah.
about before. So it all kind of ties together. It's fascinating, honestly.
We almost have like a theme for our podcast when we get the Star Wars and sci-fi
Yeah.
episodes to connect
And
somehow.
it's not even all intentional either. It kind of just comes together. I guess it's just stuff that's going through our heads and just
I think it
happens.
also may just be like a reflection of, I don't know if reality is the right word, but I mean, if we're studying the same thing, like these same patterns are going to emerge.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, I mean, I think we study Rome a lot. Rome, was successful because it had this trifunctionalist approach. Greece maybe wasn't successful. I mean, that's kind of why Plato's Republic has this tripartite system as the perfect system of government because it didn't really exist in the Greek world.
Right, which is why
Um,
Athens fell eventually, and
yeah,
partly under
yeah.
its own corruption and partly because of
I
Sparta.
mean, we could say like democracy existed in Rome, in Athens, but then they got fed up with it. The people are fed up with that corruption, and then it turns into mob rule.
Yep.
They
And
got
then you
rid of the
expose them
democracy.
to
They got rid of the democracy under the guise of democracy, and then they set up a tyrant,
yep.
which is like Alcibiades or
Yep.
Themistocles or
They had their own, yeah, they had
Augustus.
tyrants. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, people originally thought George Washington, I mean, the idea of him being a king was like a worry, I guess, among some. I think like there's a video game, one of the Assassin's Creeds, that actually takes an alternate history route where he became a dictatorial tyrant of a king and you had to actually like fight him and his oppression, which is pretty interesting take on it.
And that's kind of funny. I mean, yeah, I think like hypothetical situations of history are actually always really interesting. Just like, what if this happened? What if that happened? Because it helps us use our imagination to try to, improve the future. And I do like those kind of hypothetical things. I mean, I've even like yeah, I mean, what if like the colonies never separated? Or what if like the British
Yeah.
Empire was
Yeah.
able to reincorporate them back, even in
Yeah.
like the 1900s? Like Cecil Rhodes wanted to take back the Americas. He explicitly said that. It's like, what,
Even
man?
as late as okay. I mean, I
Like
understand the War of 1812. Even then, that wasn't really the aim of the British, but
he wanted to do it in the 1890s, which is like a pretty
yeah.
crazy.
I know in the Civil War, Victoria did want to kind of help the South because she thought that would be better
I mean,
for.
that's another like people are obsessed with that type of like, what
Yeah.
if the South wanted to maintain independence or something? I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
interesting.
a lot
But
of
what's
questions,
also
man. A lot
interesting?
of questions.
Yeah, a lot of questions. I know we're kind of running close on time, but
We are. So we should probably like
I'll just say this.
end soon.
It's very interesting because these were like early ideals in the Republic that sort of lasted. But a lot of the ideals of virtue and Roman ideals and philosophy and like and ancient Greek philosophy didn't really last past the Jacksonian era. So that's
Exactly.
interesting to
Yep.
think
I was gonna
about.
say same thing. I
Yeah.
mean, Jackson was controversial figure to say the least, but definitely changed things a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, well, um, I guess overall, yeah, but the importance of these, these actions, these almost kind of legends and myths that we enshrine about these founders, so to speak, and early, um, figures, they're very, they stick with us and stay with us, you know, despite um, other things changing. And then I think it's important to go back to them as ideals, uh, especially in times of, of chaos and trouble, like more than ever. So,
Yeah, yeah. I agree. And it's interesting to think about. It's interesting to think about where America is in the cycle of anacyclosis, if that's still, a valid political theory. And
right. Yeah,
um it's interesting. These are a lot of relevant, timely, but I think eternally timely questions.
absolutely. I mean, when will humans ever really get it right and figure it out? I don't know.
When we merge with AI.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
I'm excited, man. You ready?
Interesting. It'd be interesting to get jacked in the machine, just like the Matrix. Red pill or blue pill?
Well, I'll take the purple pill maybe. I don't know.
I want a third pill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that could be an interesting like topic on future one AI, but
Oh yeah, I mean
um,
we should do a whole podcast on the Matrix itself, I think.
absolutely, I'd be tight.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, thank you for joining us today, and like, subscribe, tell your friends about it, and yeah, peace out.
Yeah, and if you want to join a podcast, I know we have some regular guests that have come on, and we're thinking about bringing some new people. But if some of our viewers want to jump on and maybe discuss something cool, it doesn't necessarily have to be Rome. Could be sci-fi, could be music. It'd be interesting. So take care until then. George Washington's farewell address on September 19th, 1796. A few highlights in his farewell address. In looking forward to the moment which is intended to terminate the career of my public life, my feelings do not permit me to suspend the deep acknowledgment of that debt gratitude which I owe to my beloved country, for the many honors it has conferred upon me, and the steadfast confidence with which it has supported me. Profoundly penetrated with this idea, I shall carry it with me to my grave as a strong incitement to the unceasing vows that heaven may continue to you the choicest tokens of its beneficence, that your union and brotherly affection may be perpetual. The name of American must always exalt the just pride of patriotism. You have, in a common cause, fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils, joint efforts, and common sacrifices. I warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindlies animosity, and foments riot and insurrection. Observe good faith and justice toward old nations. Cultivate peace and harmony. Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity of a nation with its virtue? Though I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible for my defects not to think I am probable that I may have committed many errors. Whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever favorite object of my heart. George Washington, September 19th, 1796.